What's going on? So we want a script that will take your selected items and space them out incrementally, whether it's sort of 1 second or 2 seconds or whatever you like. Cool, so let's jump into it. So we'll go to Actions, New Action, New Rear Script, and I always recommend doing your own ones in a folder of your choosing. That way they're easier to track. So this is going to be space clips, space items, what would you call it? With specified gap. Yeah, that'll do. Only because we'll probably have different space item scripts down the track. This is only one type that we'll use. So that's a good enough name. You know, it's fairly straightforward. So remember from the previous videos, hyphen is a comment. So we can, as a header, sort of write what we intend to do. A script that will prompt the user for a desired gap and then space out all selected items with that gap in between. Good enough description? I hope so. Cool. All right, so I don't think I did this in the previous video because I was just trying to keep it a bit simple, but this is how I usually lay out these scripts. I have a function called main, and this is where we execute the main set of instructions. Sorry, no. This is where we define the main set of instructions, and this is where we execute the main set of instructions. So how this works is when you have a function outlined like this, and you have stuff that it does in here, you know, you define the set of instructions, but unless you have this line down here or elsewhere, this doesn't actually happen. I guess an analogy for that would be if you buy a cookbook, right? Jamie Oliver's 11-cent meals or whatever. And you take the cookbook home and you put it on your bench, you know, just because you have that cookbook doesn't mean that food appears, right? Because the cookbook is a set of instructions, and until you actually execute on those sets of instructions, the food won't appear. So in that analogy, this is the cookbook, and this is you actually doing what it says in the cookbook. Hopefully that analogy lands. But anyway, this is how I like to outline my scripts. I have a main function, and then actually at the very bottom of the script is where we actually do the stuff, and then it runs through. It's a subtle difference, but that's how I do it. All right, so let's, same as previous video, let's just, in plain English, write out what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So first, we're going to prompt the user in a text box for a desired gap and store as a variable. So yeah, the variable could be user specified gap. So that'll be the gap that the user chooses, and that value is going to be stored as a variable, and the variable's name in the script is user specified gap. And remember that capitalization matters, so when we use this variable we have to get that perfect, because user specified gap is not the same as user specified gap with the S and the G. It's very important to remember. That's why you'll see me often, instead of typing stuff out again, I'll just copy and paste it, and that way I know it's exactly the same. something to bear in mind. So we're going to get, the desired gap. So that's very good. And then we're going to count the number of selected items and store that number as a variable. So that variable name will be num of selected items. Cool. So we've got our number of selected items. Now, how this is going to work, when we do the spacing script, the first item won't move. It's all the subsequent items that'll move. So it'll end up looking something like this, you know, with the perfect increment in between them. So this one won't move. So everything's going to sort of be anchored around that first item. So we want to get the starting position of the first selected item. Group is very convenient because when you select things like this, this is the first item. So it works quite well. So we want to get the starting position of the first item. We're also going to need the ending position of the first item. And then we can get the length as well. Length of the first item. So the length being, you know, roughly 880 milliseconds or whatever this is. That's what I refer to as the length. So we're going to get those three things just of the first item. Okay. Now what are we going to do? So I guess then we start moving stuff, don't we? Once we have that first little bit of information. So the first item doesn't move. That's an easy one. The second item, we set the start position of the second item to be end position of first item plus user specified gap. Does that make sense? So we've got our first position here, end position of first item is here. This is our user specified gap, so that's where item number 2 lands. That's what I mean by that. So then the third item, if there is one, maybe you only have 2 selected, but maybe you have 17, right? Assuming there's more than 2, the third item, we set the start position to be end position of second item plus user specified gap. So you can see a pattern here. And then the fourth item will be the start position of, the end position of the previous item plus the gap. Everything's the previous position plus gap. That's how it goes. Now, if we're going to write a useful script that can accommodate many, many items selected, like 500, for instance, it's going to take a while to write all that out if we're writing it just, you know, first item do this, second item do this, third, fourth, all the way down to 500. You know, that's kind of crazy, right? So that, I suppose, introduces the concept of loops. So you can do a repeated set of actions for as many times as you tell it to, which is really, really cool. So what we're going to do is repeat the following for as many items as we have selected. So this is something you can do in coding, which is really useful. Well, first of all, if we're looking at the first item, do nothing. But if we are looking at any subsequent item, then if we're looking at any subsequent item, then set the start position to be the previous item's end position plus the user specified gap, the end. So we can repeat that for as many items as we have selected. So then we don't need to do like 2 lines of code for for every item again and again and again. We can just make a loop that accommodates any circumstance, whether it be 3 items selected or 500. So that's really, really cool. And is that all we're doing? So we get the first item stuff because everything pivots around that. And then we start our loop. So we can get rid of these comments because we're not doing it line by line anymore. We're doing a loop. All right, so let's start getting into this stuff. So, like always, we're going to open up the Reaper API. All right, so you remember this guy? Very daunting, but as you do more and more of this stuff, it'll become less daunting, I suppose. All right, so let's leave the prompt for now. Let's just hard set the gap as 1, and let's just make the script work with a 1-second gap at all times. So count the number of selected items. Now, from memory, that was count media item, count selected media items. That's the one. I remember that gave me trouble in the first video, finding that one. So remember how this is formatted. It gives you the syntax for the different programming languages that you can write Reaper scripts in. For all of my videos, we're looking at the Lua. So just to talk about what this is the name of the function. Any function that starts with Reaper dot means it's something that comes with the Reaper package. It's something that you can call on, a preset function that you can call on, as opposed to a function that we're writing, which is this, right? You know, this isn't a Reaper function. This is something that we're making together. Whereas this is a pre-made function that isn't defined in this page. It's defined behind the scenes, you know, beforehand by the developers. So yeah, this is the name of the function. Inside of the brackets are the arguments that it takes. So the bits of data that you feed into the function in order that it can do the thing that you're asking it to do. And the only thing it needs to know is what project we're talking about. In our case, we're talking about the active project, which is 0. That's how Reaper works. 0 is the active project. So you feed in 0 into the brackets, and it'll find the stuff you're looking for. Over here, before the function name, is the thing that the function returns. Not all functions return anything, but a lot of them do, especially on this page. So we're returning an integer. An integer is a whole number, and that integer represents the number of selected items. So let's copy that. So we're counting the number of selected items and we're storing that as an integer. So when you go number of selected items equals the function, the integer that this function returns will be stored as this. That's what we're doing here. We're counting the number of items, and that number is stored in this variable. Now, like I mentioned before, the only thing we need to pass in is the active project, which is given by the number 0. So that'll work. We'll be able to run this, and that'll give us that number. Okay, moving on. So get the starting position of the first selected item. Cool. So it'll be something like get media item info. That's the one, get media item info underscore value. This is a more complicated one because there's a lot of things that you can get from it. Whether it's muted or not, I don't even have to read what half of these actually mean. But the ones we're looking at are length and position. But I haven't really explored all of this stuff, but there's a lot of data that you can extract from the item for use in your script. So this D underscore position in capitals is what you put in here, the parameter name. So yeah, this function here takes two arguments. We need to tell it what item we're actually talking about and that what piece of information we'd like to know about it. So we want to know about the position. And then it returns a number. So it returns a value for the thing that you're asking it about. So yeah, when you ask for the position, it'll tell you that in the form of a number, which is fantastic. Get the starting position of the item. So we'll call that first item start pos. So this will return a number, and we're storing that on this variable name. So we need the item, and we want the D underscore position. Now you can't just copy and paste it in like that. It needs to be in quotes. And the clue that it needs to be in quotes is that it's a string. So this needs to be in quotes, D position, without the space on the end. Notice how when I copy and pasted it, the space came along for the ride. That I assume that means it's not going to work because a space is a part of a string. So we need it to be exactly as it should be without the space. So that'll get the position. Now the thing that we're not getting yet, the thing that we haven't got yet is the item. So what we need to do beforehand is we need to get the first selected item and store a reference to it. And that reference will pass into here, item. So we're going to have to do that first. So what do we look for? Get selected item or something like that. Get selected media item. That's the one. So this is a function. And you can see it returns a media item as a data type. So that's good. That's what we want. And we'll just call that, now let's call it first item. First item is, so it needs to know about the active project, which is 0. And then just taking a step back for a moment, how this works is when you select items like this in Reaper, this is item number 0. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it indexes them, and the first number is 0, which sort of trips people up. It's a little bit counterintuitive. It's not typically how we count things in real life, but in computers, the first one is 0. So if we're looking at the first item, we want the 0 item. Okay. Cool. So now we have our reference to the first item. So that'll go here. So that's very good. Right, so going back to this thing, because we're going to use this again, and this time we're going to use it to get the length. So it's going to be exactly the same as this, but instead of D position, it's D underscore length. So first item length equals D length. Now, notice how there isn't a end position available in this function. It'd be handy if there was, but it's not a big deal, because all we have to do is, instead of calling it directly, we can calculate it. And the end position is going to be the start position plus the length. That makes sense, right? If the start position here, and it has a value relative to the start, which is 0, and then the length has a value, then start plus length will be the end position. So that's how we get the end position there. Cool. All right. So now we're on to our primary feature, which is the loop. So basically we're just going to translate this, these English sentences into Lua sentences. Now the syntax for this is, now there's a complication here, and this is probably the most complicated thing about this script. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it in a way that's easily understood, but it's actually not going to work straight away. And then we're going to make it work. And hopefully that helps you understand how it works, because there's a hitch with this, basically. But bear with me. So basically we're doing this line. So for I equals 1, until, so what I've written here is from the first until whatever number this is, it could be 6, it could be 500. From 1 to 500, incrementing by 1 each time, do the following. Okay? So what that means is, from the first time to 500 times, do stuff that many times. That's basically what this means. Right? Now, if I is 1, then do nothing, because remember, we don't move the first item. However, if anything else is true, if anything but I equals 1 is true, then do stuff. Move items accordingly. Now, just a quick note, we did mention this in the previous video, but the double equals refers to a comparison, whereas the single equals refers to an assignment. So please be aware of that. And that's, I know it kind of looks funny, especially if you're new to coding, but when we're comparing things, we use the double equals. Single equals is for assignment. All right, so if we're looking at the first item, then we do nothing. So what's going to happen is we're going to start with I equals 1. It's going to go down here. It's going to check to see if this is true. It is going to be true because it's the first one. We're going to hit this comment, which is nothing, and then it's going to go to the end here. It's going to skip over the else because this was true. It's going to go to here and then the end, and then it's going to go back up to here. And now I is equal to 2 because we're increasing by 1 each time we go around the loop. So now I is equal to 2. So it checks if I is equal to 1, and it's not this time because it's 2. So it skips over this and it goes to the else. And now it does whatever's in here, and then goes to the end, and then to this end, and then back to the start. And now I equals equal to 3. So it's going to go to here, into here, and it's going to keep going around that loop until I reaches whatever the final value is. And then it's going to do it one more time. And then when it gets to the end, it's going to continue on. That's how loops work. Go around and around for as many times as you tell it to. Okay, so if I is not equal to 1, then we're in here. And what do we want to do? We want to set the starting position to be the previous item's end position plus user specified time. Cool. All right. So what do we need to do? We need to set, we need a function that will set an end position, set a start position. So set. Get set media item info. I think that's the one. I do find it confusing when they have functions called get set. But basically what that means is you can either get information about it or you can set new information about it, or potentially both. It's sort of like a function that does a lot of different things. I believe that get set. No, sorry, my apologies. That's not the one we want. We want one that has access to stuff like the start position. Here we go. Set media item position. Very straightforward. Cool. So set media item position. We tell it which item, what the starting position is, and then refresh UI. This is what we used in the first video, I'm pretty sure. That's cool. And then it returns a Boolean, and that is whether it succeeded or not, I think. But we're probably not going to need that. So we're going to use this one. So we need a reference to the item. So we need to get a reference to this ith item, whatever I equals at that iteration through the loops. Get a reference to the ith item, and then we need to so yeah, we need a new position is going to equal previous end position plus user specified gap. Now let's take a step back and think about how it's going to work from the first one. So if it's the first one, we don't do anything, right? But then for the second one, we want the new position to be the first item's end position plus the user specified gap. Okay, and then we use that to set the new position. And then at the end of this loop, before it goes back to the start, we want to store this item's end position as a variable to use for the next one. So if we're looking at the second item, we want to store the end position of the second item after it is moved as a variable so that the third item can use it to align itself. And then when we move the third item, we want to store that in position so that the fourth item can use that to align itself. So what we can actually do is we can rename this as previous item end position. Previous item end position. So then we're going to update previous item end position to be referring to this item's end position. That's one of the really powerful things about variables is you can set it as an initial value, but then you can update it at certain points throughout your script so that we can keep using it in different ways. That's why it's called a variable, is because its value is variable. It's able to be changed. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to update its value to be talking about the most recent one that we're talking about. That's what we're going to do. Okay. So where are we? We need to get a reference to this ith item. Cool. So we've already sort of done that. We use this function, get selected media item. So let's look at that. So this will be item equals. So remember, you can click on the function to see what the arguments it takes are and what order, because the order matters, right? The first argument, this one here, is the Reaper project. So that's correct. It's still 0. But now we're not always talking about the first item. We're actually talking about the ith item. And now this is where we circle back to this first one. Remember at the start, I sort of hesitated a bit and I was like, I'm going to write it one way, but it's not going to work, but then I'm going to correct it. So we're up to that point now. The reason why this isn't going to work is because when we index things or count items in Reaper, the first one is 0, not 1. So what this really needs to be is starting at 0 until the number of items minus 1 do the stuff. And then this line here is, if we're looking at the first one, then do nothing. Yeah, see, I don't I don't like this because this looks really complicated and it's a little bit confusing, isn't it? But that is how it has to be, just because of how Reaper indexes things. And that's not necessarily Reaper's fault. You know, this is really common in programming languages. When you have an array of things, the first index is actually 0, not 1. So yeah, now this is going to work because when I is 2, when we get the selected item, I will be 2, and this will be, sorry, let me start again. Let me say that again. When we're looking at the second item, so this one here, I will be 1 because 0 is the first, 1 is the second. So then when we get into here and we're getting the selected item, this value will be 1, and this reference will be the second item. Boy, we got there. Hopefully that makes sense. Cool. So we've got our for loop properly formatted now, and it's going to do the counting as it's meant to be. So we've got our reference to the item, and we're going to use that to set that item's position, because this function needs to know which item we're talking about. So that's why we need a reference to it. The new position we've already calculated. So it's previous item end pos plus the user specified gap. So that's our new position. And refresh UI, I don't think we need that, so we can just write false. Oh no, sorry, we talked about this in the previous video. We want it to be true because when it's false, it does this odd thing where it doesn't actually update the screen until you click away from the script. Yeah, we don't want that. I'm not quite sure what the utility of that is. I'm sure there's a good reason for that option, but yeah, we don't want that. Maybe it's when you're doing like lots of different commands and this is like in the middle somewhere. You don't want to be updating the screen 1,000 times. You just want it to update once at the end when everything is finished. Maybe that's what it's for. But for this one, we just want it to update. Cool. So now we need to update this. So now we're going to go previous item. Right, so what we need to do is, so we already have the new position of this item. We need to get the length of this item, right? So we can do that copying this function. For this, I'm going to go write local, this item's length. I'll explain that in a moment. We're talking about item, and we're talking about the length. Let me come back to the word local. It's important. So we've got this item's length. Store the item's end position. So previous item end pos is going to equal the new position plus the length. Cool. So in each iteration, when we get to here, we're looking at the previous item's end position. Then we move it, and then we update the end position to now be talking about the thing that we just moved. And then when we loop back around to the next one, we're now talking about that one we just moved. Hopefully that makes sense. Now the word local, what this means is if you write the word local before a variable name, this variable will only have memory stored in it for the duration of the scope of this bit of code. Now, when I talk about scope, I'm talking about everything between this else and end. That's the scope of this block. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to write local in front of these three because they're the ones I want to be local. So what's going to happen is when we enter this block here, it's going to create a variable called item. It's going to store some data in it. It's also going to create new position and it's going to create this item's length. But then when it gets to here and then gets to this end, it's going to loop back around to here. We've gone out of scope of this block. And what happens is these items, these variables, they go out of scope, which means the data that they contain disappears. But that's okay because we don't need it anymore, because when we get back to here and we go through the new iteration, we want to be talking about a different item and we want to be talking about a different new position. So each time it goes around this loop, we're creating a fresh one of these each time. Now, I have to say that if you got rid of those, it will still work. The difference will be is that when it loops back around and gets back to here, there will already be an item, but we're just going to paste over the top of it with new data. And that'll work just fine. But in my mind, it's a little bit cleaner to be destroying that data each time it goes out of scope, because we don't actually need it anymore. It's just, to me, it's a little bit neater doing it this way. In this example, it's a subtle difference. But yeah, it is a word that's worth, it's a keyword that's worth knowing what it means, especially if you're reading someone else's code. And yeah, sometimes it's very necessary to specify that things are local to a certain scope. Yeah, if you're interested, maybe do a little bit more research on that. But that's what it is and how it's working in this instance here. Okay. All right, so what have we done? We've done all this. We might be finished. You know, I feel like there's got to be something that I did wrong, right? You know, very rarely do you nail it first time, but let's give it a go. So Control S will compile and run. Oh my God, first time. What about that? So did it work correctly? Let's just go Control Z. Do it again. Cool. So this one didn't move, and they do look equally spaced. Yeah, 1 second. There we go. 1 second apart. Fantastic. Let's just try it again with a different gap. There we go. Now, let's see what happens. This is one of the things that you should do when you create scripts. You should always think like, how can I make it go wrong? Because there might be things that you haven't accounted for. So let's see, like at the moment, I've not selected any items. Let's see what happens. So there's an error here. So it's looking for a media item. And if we trace that back, you know, we're trying to store a reference to a media item. We're trying to store a reference to the first selected media item, but there isn't any. There is no selected media item. So, I mean, it's okay if it errors here. It's not a big deal, but I suppose it's not great to have a script that does error. So what we can do is right here, check that we have at least one item selected. And in fact, we should probably be checking that there's at least two, because if there's only one, you know, it didn't do anything because it didn't move this item, right? It only does something if there's at least two. So let's do that. Let's check that there's at least two. So one of the things that you can do is greater than 1, then continue. So I'm going to highlight all of this, tab, and then put a new end here. So it might not be super clear what I just did. I basically embedded all of this action inside of this if statement. So what's going to happen is if you don't have any selected, you run the script. See, it didn't error that time. We run the script, you know, it goes here, good, and then it's saying, it's looking at this number and it's saying, is there more than 1? And the answer was no, because the answer was 0. So then it doesn't enter this block of code. It goes all the way to the end and then to the end, and we're out. That's the end of the script. So it's only actually going to do this stuff if there's more than 2 selected. So let's put it back over here. There we go. So now we're error free. Cool. Like I said in the previous video, what I would usually do is I'd start deleting some of these comments that are a little bit obvious, but I might leave them just for your benefit because they might be useful. We haven't done the prompt the user thing, so I might do that in the next video. It'll be a short video. At the moment, it's just, you know, a value that you update and run. But it'd be cooler if it came up with a text box saying like, what do you want your value to be? So that would be the plan. But yeah, let's end this video here. I hope you got something out of it. Thanks.